Hey everybody, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Jeanne Soileau's Propaganda and Propagation, the education of children in South Louisiana through their own schoolyard lore. The schoolyard has been this fascinating area of research for children's lore because one of the things to consider about a schoolyard is that it is consistent. There is a persistence of time over place, and in many ways over the folk group itself. Imagine, think about your own school growing up. And let's just think about our primary schools, although obviously high schools have the same sort of consistency to them. But they are located in a particular place, in a particular neighborhood. They are going to be drawing from the same from the same neighborhood, the same group of people. Now that neighborhood might shift, but that over time, and the dynamics and the social makeup of that neighborhood might shift over time. But it might be defined by either being remarkably homogeneously ethnic. It might be remarkably heterogeneously ethnic. And that those patterns might shift over the years, but it is a place. It is a place where you will go and in an early grade, and you will be the youngest there, and you will move forward through the ranks. It's highly regimented because of the grade system, and you will go from being a neophyte there to an elder there. But in that process, you will be learning the shared repertoire of the group, and then subsequently sharing that repertoire to the next generations. It might seem strange to think about generation in this context, but that's the nature of a folk group. You move from neophyte to elder over time. It's just that in the school period, it's remarkably contracted process, as opposed to the generation of parents and children. Think about it in university as well. University lore is, it's a 4-year program, and often after your second year, you're not necessarily as engaged in sort of the more folky group activities of the place, like Frosh Week and so on. So you come in as a Frosh. The second years are often the people who are running Frosh Week, and then the next year you are the Frosh. And the entire group replenishes after 4 years. The entire group replenishes in the schoolyard after 6 years. But a remarkable consistency in time. And because it has to do with neighborhood, is a distinct possibility that your siblings went there or are going to go there, maybe at the same time, maybe times hence. It's not even an impossibility that your parents went there. So there's this long arc of history, but the group iterating over time. It's also one of the first places where you are consistently gathered with people who are not your family. As a child, we could, nursery schools perhaps are an example of that, but as a child, you are, your first folk group might be your family. You might have neighborhood friends as well. But, depending on how early in the system that you entered, your school group might be one of the first folk groups that you actually enter into and have to form new relationships. Again, neighbors might be there. There might be some tendrils, but it's its own thing. And what is more, the schoolyard is unsupervised in terms of its talk, at the very least. Obviously, playtime is supervised, and people can't get too rowdy and so on. And there's the issue of fights, and so there are people, there are teachers, poor suckers, who are on some kind of responsibility for making sure that play doesn't get too rowdy. But in terms of talk, in terms of the conversations that can be had, they're not really listened to. So it's children talking to children. And it's in that context where things get communicated. And so the schoolyard shows this remarkable amount. It's a sort of a perfect test case in many ways of some of the basic ideas of folklore, because it has this passing around aspect to it. It is a newly formed, emerging folk group that nevertheless has consistency over time. So, whatever the heck elementary has been at whatever the heck street for 50 years. And although clearly generations upon generations upon generations of students have gone through, if you think of a generation as a year, or if you think of a generation as the 6 years of elementary school or whatever, nevertheless, there's this consistency over time. It's that it's sort of that classic puzzle about, if you replace all the parts of the ship, I'm going to remember, I'll look it up, but that riddle, that sort of classic conundrum about if you replace all the parts on a ship over time, is it the same ship? And if you replace all the people in a folk group, is it the same folk group? It's like, well, yeah, kind of, but it is new. And so it displays this remarkable amount of conservatism, because, especially since much of the language is formulaic, rhymes and so on, or riddles or puns, much of the content of children's oral communication is in that form. They are forms that allow for consistency over time because they're memorable. That being said, because they are forms, they're also rife for satire and adaptation and evolution and so on. So they become, they also display this remarkable dynamism over time. So they're kind of a classic example. And Soileau has been doing this work for years. Other folklorists have as well. The Opis, the husband and wife team of the Opis, they sort of more or less founded the contemporary idea of children's folklore. They operated in schoolyards. John Widdowson was recently part of the editorial that gathered together this classic work, this classic bit of field work from London schoolyards. And Soileau has this is basically her life's work. Her 2018 book won the Opie Prize, which is the book given for the children's folklore section of the American Folklore Society for best publication of the year. And what is more, it won the Chicago Book Prize, which is basically the best folklore book of the year. So that's her cred. Now, she uses this concept of propaganda that basically, she's interested in the themes that are being expressed. And I'm not 100% sure whether propaganda is the right word right here. I think she likes the assonance with propaganda and propagation, and clearly they are etymologically related. But and one of the things that gives me pause is that there's a sort of a remarkable distinction between propaganda and propagation. I think it's C.S. Lewis who basically said that propagation is the intentional spreading of an idea that is that the believer holds to be true and the believer holds to be important. So he'd be talking about things like faith, but you could be talking about, on a sort of as neutral of plane as possible, the propagation of things like hygiene practices, like, hey, you should be washing your hands, you should be brushing your teeth, and so on. So propagating an idea that way, whereas propaganda is usually the spreading, the pushing of an idea that is irrespective of the person's actual belief system. In fact, often is associated with what the teller actually knows to be not true. Rather, it is the intended effect of that, spreading that idea that is desired. It's the creation of an enemy, for example, the creation of a parallel reality where something is proven to be successful when clearly all objective reality would suggest that it is not. So like the propaganda of the Stalinist stage, where they would mention things like how crops had met their projected goals where millions of people are starving. So that kind of thing. I think more to the point, the word that she would probably would be more useful to consider would be something like hegemony. So this notion of this the worldview that power would like to express as much as possible. Things like the powerful like to express as much as possible. So things like the subtle benefits of capitalism and commercialism, the notions of what comprises the ideal family, notions of what comprises the ideal worker and consumer, and so on, what comprises the ideal sort of gender patterns and the like. And hegemony is presented to us not directly through our through dictates, although you can make an argument that sometimes it is through legislation, for example, and who benefits from the legislation of the state, and like what kind of families benefit from the legislation of the state, and what kind of families are left behind. but also it's more done through the support of cultural products. So think of things like sort of classic 1950s television sitcoms, where the happy family was projected as suburban and middle class, and the mother was at home, and the father went out to work, and the children were, obedient or naughty in so much as that drove the plot, and then of course. Acquiesced at the end to the wisdom of their family, and so on, and all sort of sponsored through the advertising that American television relied on. So that's sort of what the cultural values that the state wishes to impose upon a group, and the state slash capitalism wishes to impose upon the population, but doing so through artistic means, doing so through its cultural products that suggests, ain't this great? At which point you can start talking about counter-hegemony, which is a big thread in folklore, and the idea that people are aware of the messages that are being sent towards them and are pushing back. They might not be able to overturn them entirely, but at the very least, there are forms that critique these, and play and parody is one of them. And so the idea that there are cultural forms that are expressly pushing back against these state ideas is sort of is fundamental in many aspects of folklore study. It's a mid-20th century realization, in part because that's when Antonio Gramsci's work started to percolate into North American and for that matter, European folklore study. But just as importantly, it is something that once you move away from the sort of idealized folk and the functionalist notion, where these things were about the folk patterns were about this sustaining of culture, and then you realize, well, a lot of folklore is actually about critiquing one's place in culture. I was like, oh, okay, there is this balance, and you can look at things like the fairy tale as a structure, as something that is on one hand perpetuating these ideas, but because they are kind of the ideas of personal responsibility and the value of the family and the value of economic independence and so on, and all those sort of things, those values that are required, simultaneously, because it is a joyful genre, it is something that can be counter-hegemonic. And children's folklore is often both, because on one hand it's very conservative. It is repeating the patterns that are being presented to it, repeating those ideas in a reasonably sort of straightforward ways, echoing what the culture wants you to talk about. Simultaneously, it mocks it, it critiques it. So, for example, it's not uncommon in the schoolyard for children to sing commercial jingles. When an advertising campaign has a jingle in it that seems to be very catchy and popular and directed towards children, the idea that children will sing it doesn't necessarily seem that unusual. It is in a way, kind of enters into their folk consciousness as a folk song. Don't want to push that too far, but I think I'm right in that. Simultaneously, however, it's also, because it's a ubiquitous piece of music with a ubiquitous pattern and words, it's rife for parody. So commercial jingles can be made fun of. And so you have both this, on one hand, this acceptance of what the culture is giving, and that enters into folk patterns, and simultaneously it pushes back against it. So one of the cool things, or ironically one of the cool things, when one studies children's folklore, and especially in the schoolyard, you will come across these texts that are actually old commercial jingles. Long after the advertising campaign has disappeared, the song remains. So there's a campaign, I think from the 70s, or McDonald's is my kind of place. And I remember hearing that in the late 80s. I remember hearing it in the 70s, and parodies that were in my schoolyards, Osgood Street Public School in Ottawa. And But you still come across those sorts of things today. You'll sometimes come across these remnants of old advertising jingle parodies, which again expresses the conservatism and the dynamism. A text enters into the consciousness. It is then turned into a parody, and then that parody persists as a text with remarkable lack of variation over time. So it's kind of an interesting deal. So brand names are one of the examples, the use of sort of commercial brands that are in place. But just as importantly are sort of patterns of behavior. So it's not simply consumerism and the consumer ideals of branding. It is also such things as body type and masculinity and femininity as presented. So she notes these themes: racism, gender conformity, adherence to corporate advertising lures, drug and sex enticements, and images of parenting. Are all themes that you can pick out. She's calling them propaganda. I'm calling them hegemony, but basically that's what that's what her area of concern is. And one of the things I love, I think you should take a lot from this article, but one of the things I love is how she describes her content as the work of anonymous child poets. That she's not searching for origins, because those might be impossible, but the idea that, and she uses poet in large part because they often are in the form of verse, whether song or whether skip rope rhyme or something. But it's the fact that they are carried forth. So we can perhaps locate their origins in some kind of time. Clearly, a parody, we know when a parodic text, we don't know exactly when a parodic text would enter into, but we have it couldn't be before this time. It could, a parody of the McDonald's is my kind of place couldn't exist before the McDonald's is my kind of place ad campaign entered into the consciousness, and so on. You can do a parody of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles theme before 1985, 1986, or whatever, but it is conscious there. And her method is just open-ended questions, and they're not about what do you think of sex? What do you think of consumerism? That wouldn't necessarily be successful, but because it's kids. But just general texts, general questions about how you count people out, counting out rhymes, or skip rope rhymes, or so on, is one of the things that will just present these texts to her, and then those texts are the things that she can subsequently analyze. You can go through her content. I'm not going to summarize it right now because that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. But one of the things that she noticed is the use of racist terms, the uses of scatological terms persists. That despite the increased concern of the late 20th and early 21st century about the elimination of ethnic slurs, and of course the sort of overall cleanliness and overall concerns about sort of propriety and keeping children as desexualized as possible. It is remarkable how much these terms persist. And her argument is not that it is a demonstration of ongoing racism. It doesn't dispute the idea of ongoing racism either, but rather it is knowing that these terms are taboo encourages, in the experimental forms of play and in the perceived safety of the sort of the private groups that are coming together in the schoolyard, it is playing with what is taboo. It is playing with words that we know are inappropriate. She uses the sort of eeny meeny miny mo, catch a tigger by the toe, and she suggests that the persistence of a word other than tigger or tiger, it was in place. When I was a kid, we were using tigger at that point, as in the Winnie the Pooh character, I guess. I knew about tiger, but it was also whispered in that sense, what word they used to use. And of course, I'm not going to repeat it, but context should give it, what word they used to use. And so even then, this would be late 70s, even then there was the recognition that there was something taboo about what's going on. And it's something that I know then not to repeat it to my parents, or in certain contexts, but I was like, that sort of fascination that the children have with taboo. One of the other things is how there's this remarkable creativity. A very simple verse can be can be elaborated on. It's elaborated on for two reasons. One, something like a skip rope rhyme, you need to have text to continue if it's going to keep going. But on the other hand, it provides this entry point. It provides this mode of experimentation. So a very simple rhyme can expand and expand and expand depending on the individual anonymous child poet. And she isn't suggesting that the children that she was collecting from weren't creators themselves, weren't part of those anonymous child poets. She couldn't necessarily indicate. I think there's one point where she talks about, they say that this is one that they themselves wrote, and maybe that's true and maybe that's not true, but certainly at the very least the children would have understood it as a new thing, or at least perhaps a variation on something, a recombination of motifs that was had. But clearly it is a text that also fits within that dynamic tradition. The fascination with drugs is one of them, the whole sort of hippie texts and things about LSD. Again, in a room, in a context, it's good to think, here's a way of sort of expressing it. It's good to think of the schoolyard as being in some kind of dynamic tension with the classroom itself. And so within the classroom, all those things of good citizenship, which we can agree with, without sounding too radically conservative or old guard. It's like, okay, yes, all those things are being talked about in terms of how, the increased erasure of the perceptions of racial differences and the grasp of racial equality. The things like inculcating not necessarily rigid sexual patterns, but at least safe sexual behavior, and explaining issues of risk, talking about things like being drug-free and so on. We don't necessarily have to go, again, sound too archly conservative to say, at least you should be educated on this. Those ideas of what authority is telling them, the authority of the teacher, who might, of course, be a beloved person in their lives, gets tested, played with in the schoolyard. So that's the kind of diamond, and outside of the context, outside of that classroom, but generated by, oh my goodness, I'm having an insight, generated by perhaps the discussions that were being presented in that classroom. All of a sudden, we think of the schoolyard as kind of like Goffman's Backstage, where you have, I usually try not to have epiphanies mid-video, but Irving Goffman's dramaturgical analysis and the idea that there's these performance teams that we follow these sort of social scripts, and the groups know how to behave because personal interaction is a strange thing. So largely we follow scripts, or scripts are not necessarily literal texts, although often they are, but sort of assumptions of characterization. And so he calls these things performance team, how to behave in a particular situation. We know when you go into a classroom, you behave thusly. And one of the things that you're doing in grades 1 and 2 is learning how to be a student, how to take the teacher as both an authority, but also as a friendly authority, and so on 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 and so on. So you have a performance team of student and teacher, and that is a space. And Goffman talks about how you have front stage and backstage. And front stages are things like in the classic example is a restaurant, where you have restaurant staff and restaurant clientele, and they are performance teams, and they're following the expectations of the other, and there's a certain amount of front, and so the waiters are like, very well, nicely done, sir, I will get that right to you, maintaining a kind of ethos and how to be in order to sort of maximize the pleasure of the customer, or at least maximize the satisfaction of the customer in relationship to the restaurant. Then they go backstage; they are away from this, and it's like, "Do you see this jerk on table 2?" And so they have those kind of conversations. It's the same kind of conversations that take place in third spaces. It's the same kind of conversations that take place in the cultural scenes of, like the workers' lounge and so on in factories, away from management. And so the schoolyard is this where it's expressly because it's away from teachers. It's just like, we can drop the front of being an obedient student and sort of interact that way. So all of us. So what is being discussed is the things that are presented within that particular case. I might have to edit that down to make it smoother, but that's a really interesting point, I think. One of the things she notes is how much girls' verse explores embodiment. Clearly an object of fascination, not that boys' embodiment isn't also an object of fascination for both boys and girls. Girls' embodiment is not an additional level of fascination, large part because the beauty industry is much more directed towards women and teenagers, and young girls see that on the horizon, but also the understanding of of the possibility and perhaps the expected eventuality of things like pregnancy. So a lot has to do with a lot of girls' verse. We'll talk about the shape of their behinds and legs, and it's body image centered, which again, if what was trying to be taught in the classroom is on one point sort of a life of the mind and body acceptance and so on. Nevertheless, we know that there's a beauty industry out there. We know that there's a cultural industry out there that is not nearly as interested in what's the term, body positivity, and the young girls are sort of fascinated by that. As much as we might be sort of, you can be anything you want to be in the classrooms, there's also the expectation and the possibility, because they live in the world, the possibilities, the fears that are incumbent upon them in terms of things like eventually having to bear children. And so those kind of expectations. She has that interesting, I think, 2 different versions of When I Was a Girl. And she points to Gom's study of that. So it's a song, a schoolyard verse that has been around for about 150 years. Obviously, it's gone through, because it can reflect the times, it goes through modification, but the same basic structure is there. So the same fascination and fear and morbid curiosity. So again, I don't want to summarize the content too much, but the way these fears interact is, and then the way these concerns are consistent, is kind of remarkable. She then moves on to jokes, and which are formulaic, but they are not. They do not have the same kind of rigid verbal expectations that verse does. Nevertheless, one of the things that she notes, this is clearly where the issues of racial slurs come back, is how scatological, how racist those jokes might be. And again, they are largely having to do with taboo. Quoting from her again, adults are shocked when they learn that their children tell the same dirty jokes and make the same racist comments that they themselves made as children. And so, which is an interesting consideration. The question is it that these things haven't gone away? And of course, that is an answer. Or is it that these things remain an issue of fascination, like because they remain taboo, and that it's actually a sign of their taboo status that their joke lore is still as persistent as it is. Um, who knows? It's a complicated thing to sort of wrap one's head around. If the persistence of these themes, are they only understood either as playing with taboo, or they're only understood ironically? It's like, cool, but they're still being given voice to, and they still become data. So we can reserve the big conversation about what the implications of the persistence of these ideas mean, even if they seem to only be enshrined in playful talk like verse and like silly verse and joke lore. But reserve that for another day. Then she's writing this in during COVID or post COVID, and I think the last couple of pages are an interesting thing, but we could perhaps potentially dismiss. She's interested in the notion of online play, because she sees, her grandchildren were with her during COVID, and how do you have these kind of conversations that still there's taboo is being played with, but largely has to do with some of the online conversations that are being had, and some of the like the game repertoires, like games like Grand Theft Auto that are rated mature, but nevertheless children have a fascination with them because of their graphic violence, because of their sexual content, and so on, and the like. Verse seems to be remarkably absent. I think there's something about this that seems to sort of suggest that maybe this was a summing up that she wanted to do. This article came from a paper that she was giving, and she wanted to recognize the historical moment, and perhaps it was sort of, well, it's not that it's superfluous. It's just that I think it's sort of underexplored, and a different kind of coda might have been useful. But that's nitpicky. I think fundamentally, and I would really encourage you, if you're interested in this, to seek out her longer books with much more data. The analysis is still in place. This is a really great entry point because it explores, for me, it's a great thing for illustrating the dynamics of children's folklore to begin with. It's a great way of illustrating this this tension. I think Meckling talks about the sort of the inherent binary fascination that is present in children's folklore. These tensions, the male-female tension, again binary in all senses of the word. Perhaps in the past couple of years, the school systems, what I would imagine is that in the past couple of years, as an understanding of non-binary and trans kids is entering into the school systems, that on one hand play reflects that, and another hand play might push back on that, and all of us, and what's happening is that there might be like another kind of taboo that is emerging where the children themselves have an actual acceptance. Nevertheless, they recognize that it is a new thing, and so what might be in a different context be understood as anti-trans themes might be present in children's lore, but again, because it explores taboo. But I don't know, that's pure conjecture on my part. But it explores these tensions of parental authority versus children's autonomy. It's the fascination with the body. It's the fascination with consumerism. It's all these things that are very much in place, in large part because in one of the things that children's folklore does, when it's studied not as the folklore that is directed towards children, but the folklore of children themselves, is it demonstrates the active critique of the situation in which they find themselves. It demonstrates an understanding, or at least, if not an understanding, at the very least, it demonstrates a questioning about what has been presented to them. It is the place where critique happens. And again, it can be both conservative and conservative and dynamic. It can be perpetuating the hegemonic, the propaganda, using her terms, but the hegemonic, or it can be critiquing it. But it's this wonderful little area where, in the, I won't glamorize the small world of the child, the reasonably naive world of the child, is just starting to develop a repertoire of and a capacity for dialectic. And that's just kind of cool. That these things can be challenged, these things can be played with. Sometimes they're going to be clung to, and sometimes they're going to be rejected. But it's all this process of becoming. And doing so through rhyme, doing so through simple verse. These aren't complex forms, but they're complex thoughts that are buried within these forms. And that's what's cool about children's folklore in general, and that's what's cool about this article. So, again, I don't really have much else to say. My name is Ian. Today we've been talking about Jeanne Soileau's Propaganda and Propagation. As ever, my friends, I bid you well, and be excellent to each other. Bye-bye.